He had no name, no collar, and no one to call his own. Every night he slept beneath the same broken streetlight, a place as forgotten as he was. Until one winter evening, Elena, a young electrician, was sent to fix the light. When it flickered back to life, the first thing she saw wasn't the pole. It was him, a trembling, nameless dog staring at her through the falling snow. In that gentle glow, two lives met in silence. She returned the next night and the next, until he finally wagged his tail. That streetlight became their sanctuary, a small circle of warmth in a world too cold for both. There are places in every city that exist only in the peripheral vision of those who pass them by. Corners where the streetlights have long surrendered to time, where the pavement cracks into patterns that no one reads, where the wind moves through empty spaces like a whisper no one hears. This was one of those places, a narrow alley tucked between a shuttered factory and a chain-link fence, 3 blocks from the interstate, 4 blocks from anywhere that mattered, and beneath a streetlight that hadn't worked in 2 years, a dog waited. He had no name, no collar hung from his neck, no tag jingled when he moved. His coat, once perhaps golden or tan, had faded into the color of dust and rain and concrete. His ribs showed through his sides like the bars of a cage he carried with him everywhere. His eyes, dark and deep, watched the world with a stillness that seemed older than his years, as if he had learned long ago that barking brought nothing. That hope was a luxury reserved for those who had never been hungry. He slept there every night, always in the same spot, always curled beneath the dead streetlight, as if some ancient instinct told him that this was his place, his only claim to the indifferent world. During the day, he wandered. He searched through dumpsters behind the Thai restaurant 2 streets over. He drank from puddles when it rained. He avoided eye contact with humans, had learned to read their body language like a second alphabet, the ones who would kick, the ones who would ignore, the rare few who might toss a scrap but never stay. Winter was closing in. The air had begun to bite. The dog's breath came out in small clouds now, and at night he shivered so hard his legs trembled. But still, he returned, always to that spot, always beneath the broken light. No one knew why. Perhaps it was simply habit. Perhaps it was the memory of a time before when the light had worked, when someone had once paused there and looked at him with something other than disgust or pity. Or perhaps it was something simpler, the understanding that even the forgotten need a place to call their own. Elena Cruz had been working for the city's electrical department for 3 years. She was 28, small-framed but strong, with calloused hands and a quietness about her that people often mistook for shyness. She wasn't shy. She was careful. She had learned early that the world didn't always reward openness, that sometimes survival meant keeping your heart guarded, your expectations low. She had grown up in a small apartment with her mother and younger brother after her father left. Money had been tight. Love had been complicated. Her mother worked 2 jobs and came home exhausted. Her brother had fallen into trouble. And Elena had learned to fix things, broken lamps, leaking faucets, the television that only worked if you hit it just right. Fixing things made sense. There were rules, wires connected or they didn't, circuits completed or they failed. There was no ambiguity in electricity, no room for misunderstanding. People, on the other hand, were a different story. The work order came in on a Tuesday afternoon in late November. A broken streetlight on Harmon Avenue, near the old textile factory. Low priority. No complaints from residents, because there were no residents. The area was industrial, mostly abandoned, but the city had a backlog to clear, and Elena's supervisor handed her the address with a shrug. She arrived just as the sun was setting. The sky had turned that particular shade of grey that belongs only to winter, heavy and close, promising snow. She parked her truck at the curb and stepped out, toolbox in hand, breath visible in the cold air. The streetlight stood like a skeleton against the darkening sky. She could see immediately what the problem was: corrosion in the wiring, probably water damage from years of neglect. It would take her an hour, maybe less. She set up her ladder and climbed. The work was methodical, familiar: strip the old wires, test the circuit, reconnect. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as the cold bit at her fingers through her gloves. And then, as she twisted the final connection into place, the light flickered. Once, twice, and then it blazed to life. The sudden glow spilled across the alley like a revelation, washing away shadows that had lived there for years. Elena blinked against the brightness, and in that first moment of restored light, she saw him. The dog sat 15 feet away, perfectly still, staring up at her. His eyes reflected the light like twin moons. He didn't move, didn't bark, just watched her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In the glow of the streetlight, she could see how thin he was, how his coat clung to his bones, how he trembled, though whether from cold or fear she couldn't tell. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elena had never been particularly drawn to animals. She'd never had a pet growing up. Her mother said they couldn't afford it. She'd never thought much about it. But something about the way this dog looked at her, something about the stillness in his gaze, reached past the careful walls she'd built around herself. She climbed down slowly, deliberately. The dog's ears flicked, but he didn't run. She opened the door of her truck and pulled out the sandwich she'd packed for dinner, unwrapped it, tore off a piece. She knelt down 8 feet away and placed the bread on the pavement. Then she stepped back. The dog watched her. She could see the war happening behind his eyes: hunger against fear, need against survival. Finally, hunger won. He crept forward, body low, eyes never leaving her face. He snatched the bread and retreated instantly, swallowing it without chewing. Elena tore off another piece, placed it closer. Again he approached. Again he ate. They continued this dance until the sandwich was gone. The dog licked his lips, and for just a second his tail gave the smallest twitch. Not a wag, just an acknowledgement. Elena packed her tools slowly, giving him time to leave if he wanted. But when she glanced back, he was still there, sitting beneath the light she'd just fixed, watching her with those deep, unreadable eyes. She drove away as the first snowflakes began to fall. That night, lying in her small apartment, she couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he'd looked at her in that moment when the light came on, as if she'd performed some small miracle, as if, for the first time in a long time, he'd been seen. She knew that feeling. Elena returned the next evening. She told herself it was just to check the light, to make sure the repair had held, but she'd stopped at a convenience store on the way and bought a package of hot dogs. The streetlight burned steady and bright, casting its circle of illumination across the alley, and there, in the exact same spot as before, sat the dog. He lifted his head when she approached, but didn't run. There was something different in his posture now, still wary, still ready to flee, but with a thread of recognition woven through the fear. She knelt at the edge of the light and placed 2 hot dogs on the pavement. Then she sat down on the curb, 10 feet away, and waited. The dog approached more quickly this time. He ate the first hot dog in 3 gulping bites, then carried the second one back to his spot beneath the light before eating it. As if he trusted her enough to accept the food, but not enough to be vulnerable while eating it. Elena watched him in silence. She noticed the scars on his muzzle, the way one of his back legs seemed stiff when he walked. She wondered what his story was, how long he'd been out here, whether he'd ever had a home. She stayed for 20 minutes that first night, didn't try to touch him, didn't call to him or make any sudden movements, just sat in the cold and let him know she was there. As the days grew shorter and the temperature dropped, Eleanor found herself returning every evening. It became a routine, as fixed as her morning coffee, as necessary as sleep. She'd finish her shift, stop at the store, drive to Harmon Avenue, The dog was always there, always waiting beneath the light. Slowly, incrementally, the distance between them shrank. By the end of the first week, he was eating 6 feet away from her instead of 10. By the end of the second week, he no longer flinched when she stood up. By the third week, he wagged his tail when her truck pulled up. A full, genuine wag that made something warm bloom in her chest. Eleanor started bringing a blanket. She'd sit on the curb, wrapped in it, and after eating, the dog would settle on the pavement nearby, just inside the circle of light. They'd stay like that for an hour sometimes, not touching, barely moving, just existing in the same space. The world rushed past on the distant interstate, but here, in this forgotten corner, time moved differently. She started talking to him, quietly, softly, not expecting any response. She told him about her day, about the difficult repair she'd completed on a downtown traffic signal, about her brother, who'd finally gotten a job at a warehouse and seemed to be doing better, about her mother, who called too often with worries Elena couldn't fix. She told him things she'd never told anyone, about how lonely she sometimes felt, about how she'd built her life around being self-sufficient because depending on people had only ever led to disappointment, about how she was good at fixing things, but terrible at fixing herself. The dog listened. His dark eyes never left her face when she spoke, as if he understood not the words, but the weight beneath them. Elena began to notice things about him, the way he always checked his surroundings before relaxing, the way he refused to eat anything unless she placed it down and stepped back first, the way he positioned himself so he could always see both her and the alley entrance. These were the behaviors of an animal who'd survived not through luck, but through vigilance, who'd learned that the world was dangerous and trust was a risk. She understood that too. December arrived with a vengeance. The snow that had been threatening for weeks finally came in earnest, blanketing the city in white. The temperature plummeted. Elena started bringing not just food, but a thermos of warm water, a thick blanket, even a cardboard box lined with old towels that she left beneath the streetlight for shelter. The dog used the box. She found him curled inside it one evening, nose tucked under his tail, and the sight made her throat tighten. It was such a small thing, such inadequate protection against the brutal cold. But he'd accepted it. He'd trusted her enough to use it. She wanted to bring him home. The thought had been growing in her mind for weeks now, becoming more insistent with every degree the temperature dropped. But she knew he wasn't ready. She could see it in the way he still kept that careful distance, in the way he'd sometimes startle at sudden movements, in the tremor that went through him if she reached out too quickly. So she waited, and she came back, every single night. Her co-workers started to notice, started asking questions. Where did she disappear to every evening? Why did she smell like dog? Was she seeing someone? Elena deflected. She wasn't good at explaining this, didn't even fully understand it herself. How could she tell them that a nameless dog in a forgotten alley had become the most important part of her day? That sitting with him in the cold, in the silence, had begun to fill some hollow place inside her she hadn't even known existed. It was her supervisor, Marcus, who finally cornered her one afternoon in early December. Marcus was a good man, mid-50s, with kind eyes and a gentle way of asking hard questions. He'd seen Elena load a bag of dog food into her truck at the end of her shift. He didn't ask her to explain. He just told her that the warehouse had some old space heaters they were getting rid of, and if she needed one, she should take it before they went to the dump. Elena took the heater. She plugged it into a weatherproof extension cord and ran it to the box beneath the streetlight. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, when she arrived, the dog was already in the box with the heater glowing beside him. He looked up at her approach, and for the first time, his tail didn't just wag. It thumped against the cardboard in a steady, joyful rhythm. Elena sat down on the curb and opened the container of food she'd brought. But instead of placing it on the ground and stepping back, she held it out in her hand, close to her body. The dog stood. He looked at the food, looked at her. The internal war played out across his face again, that endless calculation between hunger and safety, between want and fear. Finally, he took 3 steps forward, then 2 more. And then, for the first time, he ate directly from her hand. His nose was cold and wet against her palm. His tongue was rough and quick. He ate carefully, politely, as if even now he was afraid of doing something wrong, of ruining this fragile trust. When the food was gone, Eleanor stayed perfectly still. The dog stood there, inches away, looking up at her. And then, slowly, almost tentatively, he leaned forward and pressed his head against her knee. Elena's hand moved of its own accord, coming to rest on his head. His fur was coarse and dirty, matted in places, but beneath it she could feel the warmth of him, the solid reality of his existence. She stroked gently, and the dog's eyes drifted closed. They stayed like that for a long time, connected in silence beneath the streetlight that had brought them together. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. The simple, uncomplicated warmth of being needed, not for what she could fix or provide, but just for being present, for showing up, for caring. The dog, whose life had been nothing but cold pavement and hunger and fear, for so long he couldn't remember anything else, felt something too. Something he had no name for, but recognized in his bones. Safety, the beginning of home. When Elena finally stood to leave that night, the dog followed her to her truck, not begging, not demanding, just walking beside her. As if it were the most natural thing in the world, she opened the passenger door. He looked at the interior, warm, dry, soft, and then back at her. She didn't say anything, didn't coax or plead, just stood there, door open, hand extended. And after a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity, the dog jumped inside. The dog slept in Elena's apartment that first night, curled on a pile of towels near the radiator, as far from her bedroom door as he could get while still being in the same room. Elena lay awake for hours, listening to his breathing, the small sounds he made in his sleep, whimpers and soft growls that spoke of dreams she couldn't imagine. In the morning, she called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. She took him to a veterinarian clinic that opened early, a place she'd found online that offered services on a sliding scale. The vet was a tired-looking woman in her 40s who handled the dog with practiced gentleness, speaking in low tones as she examined him. No microchip, no identification. Approximately 4 years old, severely underweight, clear signs of long-term neglect, but no fresh injuries. Worn teeth suggesting he'd been surviving on scraps and garbage. The stiffness in his back leg was old trauma, healed badly without treatment. He'd need vaccinations, deworming, dental work eventually. But overall, considering what he'd been through, he was remarkably healthy. The vet asked if Elena was planning to keep him or bring him to a shelter. Elena looked at the dog, who sat perfectly still on the examination table, trembling slightly, eyes fixed on her face as if she were the only solid thing in a tilting world. She heard herself say that she was keeping him. The vet smiled. It was the first real smile Eleanor had seen on her face. She waived half the fees. Bringing the dog into her life required adjustments Elena hadn't anticipated. Her apartment was small, barely large enough for one person, let alone a person and a traumatized animal learning to trust again. She had to move furniture to create space for him, had to dog-proof cabinets and move anything valuable to higher shelves, had to establish routines and boundaries. But the biggest adjustment was internal. For years, Elena had lived her life in careful isolation. She went to work, she came home, she watched television, she called her mother on Sundays. She had co-workers, but not friends, acquaintances, but not connections. She told herself this was freedom, this was self-sufficiency. But sitting on her apartment floor at 2 in the morning, watching a nameless dog finally relax enough to fall asleep with his head on her leg, she realized it hadn't been freedom at all. It had been fear. The same fear she saw in his eyes every time a door slammed or a voice was raised. The same fear that had kept him alone beneath a broken streetlight for so long. She started taking him on walks, short ones at first, just around the block. He walked pressed against her leg, hyper-vigilant, flinching at sudden movements and loud sounds. But gradually, day by day, the tension in his body began to ease. He started sniffing trees, started watching other dogs with cautious curiosity rather than fear, started trusting that the leash connecting them meant safety, not restraint. Elena found herself talking to other dog owners at the park. Brief conversations at first, just pleasantries about the weather or comments about each other's dogs. But it was more human interaction than she'd had in months outside of work, and she was surprised to find she didn't hate it. One woman, a retired school teacher named Dorothy with 2 elderly beagles, asked the dog's name. Elena realized she'd never named him. She'd been calling him Hey You and Buddy and Good Boy, but nothing that was his, nothing permanent. That night, she sat on the floor with him curled beside her and spoke names aloud, trying them out, seeing how they felt. Max, Charlie, Bear, Duke. He raised his head at each one, ears pricked, but nothing seemed to fit. Nothing captured who he was, this survivor, this gentle soul, who'd waited so long for someone to see him. She thought about the night they met, about the streetlight flickering to life, about how, in that moment of illumination, both their lives had changed. She thought about her supervisor, Marcus, who'd noticed her struggle and helped without being asked, about the vet who'd smiled when Eleanor said she was keeping him, about Dorothy in the park, who'd started saving her Sunday morning spot on the bench so Elena could sit beside her. She thought about light, not the kind that fell from heaven, but the kind that people made, the kind that was switched on deliberately, consciously, by someone brave enough to notice the dark. She looked at the dog, who looked back at her with those deep, trusting eyes, and she understood something she hadn't before, that names were given, but identity was earned. This dog had survived without a name, without anyone, for so long. He'd endured winter and hunger and loneliness and had still found the capacity to trust again, to love again. He hadn't just survived, he'd remained gentle. That was who he was. She didn't name him that night, but she made a decision. She would let him show her who he was, and the name would come, or it wouldn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here, that they both were. Christmas approached. Eleanor's mother called and asked if she'd come for dinner. Eleanor usually declined, made excuses, kept the holiday at arm's length because her family gatherings were complicated and painful, and reminded her of her father's absence. But this year, looking at the dog sleeping peacefully in the patch of sunlight by her window, she said yes. And she asked if she could bring someone. Her mother was surprised, asked if Elena was dating someone. Elena almost laughed. "No," she said, "not someone, something better." Christmas dinner was chaotic in the way only family dinners can be. Too much food, too many opinions, too much history crowding the small kitchen of her mother's apartment. But Eleanor's brother, who'd always been distant and difficult, spent most of the evening sitting on the floor with the dog, speaking to him in low tones about things Elena couldn't hear. Later, as she was leaving, her brother stopped her at the door. He told her the dog reminded him of himself, that he understood what it meant to be seen as damaged, to be treated as if redemption wasn't possible. But watching her with the dog, seeing the patience and care she gave freely, had made him think maybe it was possible after all. Maybe not just for the dog. Elena hugged her brother. She couldn't remember the last time they'd embraced. On the drive home, with the dog settled in the passenger seat, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. That hollow place that had been empty for so long was filling. Not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but with small moments of connection, with the quiet accumulation of days spent caring for someone other than herself. She glanced at the dog. He was looking out the window, watching the city lights blur past, and in the glow from the dashboard, she saw his tail wagging gently. They drove past Harmon Avenue on the way home. Elena slowed, looked down the street to where the alley opened up. The streetlight she'd fixed still burned bright, its circle of illumination holding back the dark. But the spot beneath it was empty now. No cardboard box, no desperate animal waiting for scraps. She thought about how random it all seemed, how she'd been assigned that particular work order on that particular day, how the light had flickered on at the exact moment the dog was looking up, how 1,000 small coincidences had aligned to bring them together. But it wasn't random at all. It was choice. Her choice to stop and look, her choice to return, her choice to care, and his choice to trust, his choice to try again. They both could have walked away. They both had every reason to protect themselves, to stay isolated, to believe that connection wasn't worth the risk. But they hadn't, and that made all the difference. By February, the dog had gained 15 pounds. His coat had regained some of its luster, revealing that he was indeed golden, underneath all the grime and neglect. The trembling had stopped. The hypervigilance had softened into something more like caution. He still didn't like sudden movements or loud voices, probably never would, but he'd learned that Elena's home was safe, that her presence meant security. And somewhere along the way, without either of them quite realizing it, he'd stopped being a dog she was helping and had become simply hers. Her dog, her companion, her family. Elena had started calling him Beacon. It had come to her one night as she watched him sleeping in his bed by the radiator, the way he'd become a kind of signal in her life, a point of light, guiding her towards something better. The name fit. When she said it, his tail wagged. But the transformation wasn't only his. Elena found herself saying yes more often. Yes to coffee with co-workers after shifts. Yes to Dorothy's invitation to join a weekend walking group at the park. Yes to her mother's requests to visit, to her brother's texts asking for advice. She'd spent so long believing that needing people was weakness, that self-sufficiency was strength. But Beacon had taught her something different. He'd shown her that vulnerability wasn't failure. It was courage. That trusting someone enough to let them see your wounds was the bravest thing you could do. She thought about this one Saturday morning as she sat in the park watching Beacon play with Dorothy's beagles. They were gentle with him, these elderly dogs, seeming to sense his past even without knowing the details. They'd approach slowly, sniff politely, then engage in the kind of low-key play that didn't overwhelm him. Dorothy sat beside her on the bench, drinking coffee from a thermos. She asked Elena how she'd found Beacon, and Elena told her about the work order and the broken streetlight and the moment of illumination. About the weeks of sitting in the cold, about the slow, careful building of trust. Dorothy listened in silence, and when Eleanor finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something Elena would never forget. She said that her husband had died 5 years ago, and for a long time afterward she'd felt like she was living in darkness. Not dramatic darkness, not the kind from movies with weeping and wailing, just the grey, grinding darkness of waking up every day and going through motions without meaning. She'd gotten the beagles on a friend's advice, thinking maybe having something to care for would help. And it had, but not in the way she'd expected. The dogs hadn't fixed her grief or made the loneliness disappear. But they'd given her a reason to get out of bed, to leave the house, to walk in the park, where she eventually met other people, to have conversations that reminded her she was still alive, still part of the world. She said sometimes we think healing is about grand transformations, about being saved or redeemed in some cosmic sense. But really, healing is smaller than that. It's getting out of bed, It's feeding someone who depends on you. It's showing up day after day, even when it would be easier not to. It's letting yourself be seen, letting yourself need, letting yourself care. She looked at Eleanor with clear, kind eyes and said that the streetlight Eleanor had fixed wasn't just a light. It was a moment when Eleanor had chosen to see something everyone else had overlooked. And in doing that, she'd given both herself and Beacon the greatest gift, the gift of being noticed, of mattering. Elena felt tears on her cheeks. She couldn't remember the last time she'd cried in front of someone else. Dorothy handed her a tissue and didn't say anything else, just sat there while Elena composed herself, while Beacon came trotting over with concern in his eyes, pressing his nose against her hand. That afternoon, Elena drove back to Harmon Avenue. She hadn't been there since the night she'd brought Beacon home. The streetlight still worked, she could see it from the road, but the alley looked different in daylight, smaller, sadder. She parked and walked to the spot where she'd first seen him. There was nothing left of their time there, no box, no blanket, no evidence that anyone had ever cared about this forgotten corner, just concrete and shadows and the steady hum of the light above. But standing there, Elena realized something profound. This place hadn't been transformed. It was still broken and neglected. The light she'd fixed would eventually fail again. Someone else would have to come repair it, or maybe they wouldn't, and it would go dark once more. The transformation hadn't happened to the place. It had happened to them, to her and Beacon. They'd found each other in the darkness and had chosen to be each other's light. She thought about all the other broken streetlights in the city, all the other forgotten corners where lonely people and abandoned animals existed in parallel isolation. She thought about how many connections never happened because someone didn't stop, didn't look, didn't care. She couldn't fix all of it. She couldn't save everyone, but she'd saved one, and he'd saved her right back. That was enough. That had to be enough. As Elena drove home, with Beacon settled contentedly in the passenger seat, she thought about the future, about how she'd need to move to a bigger apartment eventually, somewhere with a yard maybe, about how she'd like to volunteer at the shelter where the vet worked, maybe help other traumatized animals learn to trust again, about how she wanted to reconnect with her brother, to be more present for her mother, to let the people in her life know they mattered. She thought about all the small repairs she'd made over the years. Broken lights, faulty wiring, damaged circuits, and how she'd always believed the work itself was the point. But she understood now that every light she fixed was potentially a moment like this. Every repair created the possibility for someone to see something they'd missed in the dark, to notice, to care. She couldn't know which lights would matter, which repairs would change lives, but she could keep showing up, keep doing the work, keep switching on the lights. That was her job, not just as an electrician, but as a human being. When they arrived home, Beacon bounded up the stairs ahead of her, no longer the trembling, terrified creature who'd crept through her door months ago. He waited at her apartment door, tail wagging, looking back at her with absolute trust. Elena unlocked the door and they went inside together. Home. Not just a place, but a feeling. The sense that you belonged somewhere, to someone, that you were seen, that you mattered. She filled Beacon's food bowl and watched him eat with the kind of contentment that only came from knowing you were safe. From knowing that when this meal ended, there would be another one tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. She made herself dinner, and they ate together in comfortable silence. Later, they sat on the couch, Beacon pressed against her side, her hand resting on his head. Outside, the city moved through its rhythms, people coming home from work, lights switching on in windows, the world continuing its eternal dance of connection and disconnection. Elena thought about the title someone might give their story if it were told in some other context. She thought about how people loved narratives of salvation and redemption, of dramatic rescues and miraculous transformations. But this wasn't that kind of story. This was quieter, simpler, more real. This was a story about two damaged souls who'd found each other in the darkness and had decided together to step into the light. Not because they'd been saved by some external force, but because they'd chosen to save each other. One day at a time, one act of care at a time. Beacon sighed in his sleep, a sound of deep contentment. Elena closed her eyes and let herself feel something she'd denied for too long: gratitude. Not for some cosmic plan or divine intervention, but for the ordinary miracles that happened when people paid attention, when they stopped, when they looked, when they cared. For the broken streetlight that had needed fixing, for the work order that had sent her to that forgotten corner, for the courage it had taken both of them to trust again, for the light and for each other. The streetlight on Harmon Avenue still burns. It illuminates an empty alley that few people notice. But sometimes, late at night, if you're driving past and you happen to look, you might see it there, that small circle of brightness holding back the dark. And you might think about all the times in your own life when someone switched on a light for you, when someone noticed you in your darkness and chose to stay, to care, to remind you that you weren't alone. Those moments don't come from heaven. They don't fall from the sky like rain or grace. They're created by ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary compassion. By electricians who fix streetlights and then stop to feed a hungry dog. By dogs who, despite every reason to give up, find the courage to trust one more time. By all of us, whenever we choose to see the forgotten, the overlooked, the ones waiting in the cold. Light doesn't just exist, it's made, it's switched on by someone brave enough to notice the dark. Thank you for joining us on this journey of connection, healing, and hope. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Beyond the Instinct for more emotional narratives about the profound bond between humans and animals. Every story we tell is a reminder that compassion can transform lives, sometimes in the quietest, most unexpected ways. Hit that subscribe button, and let's continue discovering the light we carry for each other.